Here we go. This is for all of us. Fundamentally, a creative act was my first highlight, and I've just been smashing lots of gigs lately. We just did the Contrafact or Fiction gig at the con, and it was so much fun, and I'm really enjoying the creative act of thinking about teaching and learning. This chapter was all about what is the relationship between musical praxis and teaching and learning strategies. You might recall that a praxis is the singular, praxis would be the plural. From the Greek, it extends this idea of a practice by thinking about the moral and ethical considerations and adding what Aristotle called phronesis, or careful reasoning about the goods of the stuff you're doing. So not just judging it by the musical product, but also the inter and intrapersonal and etc., etc. And so we worked out ages ago that Eliot and Silverman think of music as musics because they think musics are made up of many musical praxes, which is the plural of praxis. And then they said, what are the goods of a musical praxis? And then out of those goods, that's where we get our teaching and learning strategies. We don't have to invent them. They're already embedded in the praxis, which is pretty cool. And then can a reflective practicum, which is where we got to last week, be inclusive of multiple musical praxes? And how does sequencing apply to music teaching and learning? So the word prac comes up a lot, right? This is a praxial philosophy of music education practice. It takes on a moral, ethical, and careful component when we talk about it with an X in it. Practicums are spaces where teachers can invite students into the musical praxis they're engaging with and prepare them for lifelong amateuring. Amateuring is the idea of having a passionate obsession for music and pursuing it wholeheartedly, but not necessarily getting paid for it. It's a way of talking about engaging with it with everything you've got passionately. The practicum is a way for students not only to musically engage as authentically, there's a really important word, deeply important, and enjoyably as possible, but also to feel that support systems exist for everyone involved. There's the care-full component there. A couple of cats there, Lee Higgins and Pat Campbell, state such an environment contributes to safety without safety. Holy heck. Think about that for the rest of our days. An environment contributes to safety without safety. The practicum promotes responsible facilitative practice, even as it also makes room for unexpected inventions. That's a pretty dense little blue bombshell. The most reasonable and effective way to develop the musicianship and listenership of music students is to structure music teaching situations as approximations of real musical praxis. We urge you to relate your own individual teaching and learning situations to the contents of this chapter. Reflective musical practicum is what we're calling it. This concept, I think, is important, even though it's only yellow, I'll address it. The practicum concept of curriculum has its roots in the ancient model of education called the apprenticeship. Reflective practicum reconceptualizes many characteristics of the old mentor-apprenticeship relationship that grounded teaching and learning in earlier times. Even today, many complex and important skills, such as those required for language use and social interaction, are learned informally through apprenticeship-like methods. That is, methods not involving didactic teaching, which might be otherwise called explicit instruction, but observation, coaching, and successive approximation. Whoa. In apprenticeship learning, target skills are not only continually in use by skilled practitioners, but are instrumental to the accomplishment of meaningful tasks, aka gigs. Said differently, apprenticeship embeds the learning of skills and knowledge in their social and functional context, aka gigs. Apprenticeship is the way we learn most naturally. The music curriculum as practicum is meant to approximate authentic musical cultures, not duplicate real-world practice, because the aim of music education is not to educate all students for careers as professional musicians. The curricular goal is to organize music classrooms and programs as effectively and genuinely as possible by simulating how music and listening are carried out by artistic musical practitioners. As Donald Schoen says, the practicum is a virtual world. It retains the essence of actual musical praxis while relieving many of the real-world pressures, risks, and distractions that could otherwise disrupt or discourage the novice. So I think that's what Higgins and Campbell are talking about with safety. The engine that drives the practicum is productive thinking in action. So we're doing and we're thinking at the same time. Music students enter into a mentor-apprenticeship relationship with musically proficient teachers who shape the actions and interactions of the musical practicum in relation to the knowings, values, standards, and traditions of carefully chosen musical cultures. Yeah, and then they just talk about you could do a lecture, but why would you? This is an interesting one. Students encounter the outcomes or backtalk of their musical thinking straight away and tangibly. So you get to try it in action. Sensory motor experiences, contextualize use of first order forms of symbolization through immersion, through living different musical ways of life. Students connect with much more than individual products. They bond with the musical praxis and practitioners responsible for individual products. I don't think there's anyone in this session today that couldn't relate to living a musical praxis and bonding with the practitioners, which is why I have plenty of pictures of me giving bass players side hugs after gigs due to the bond. I have never met you, but I love you. And if we wish to engender a lifelong involvement with and love of musicking and listening, then enabling students to live diverse musical cultures is a reasonable and an effective path to follow. And then talks about the middle school years, our bread and butter. The middle school years, which are a time for intensive involvement in apprenticeships with knowledgeable adults for the opportunity to heighten basic skills in the context of meaningful and rewarding projects, which we call gigs. Red, I thought there was actually an appropriate red because it's a critical caution. Just because a music program seems to make a prominent place for musicking doesn't mean it qualifies as a practical example of this philosophy or a reflective musical practicum. Teachers with insufficient musicianship, listenership, or educatorship are highly prone to philosophical and practical misunderstandings. Thus, many school choral and instrumental programs squander the opportunity to educate students musically because the teachers involved are not concerned with meaningful musicking and deep music listening, only simplistic sound producing. I love it when they write like that. I love you guys so much. I feel the deep bond. Overall then, there's a great deal of work to do. No joke. To transform many production-based programs into reflective musical practicums. And I feel like that's another stealthy thing that we've got to be on guard for all the time. Production-based versus reflective musical practicums. Some stuff about curriculum renewal. In this view, music curriculum development and renewal across school districts proceeds most appropriately, get ready for this, and effectively by creating a community of reflective practitioners around exemplary teaching models and materials. Go us. Go us. All right, and now we're off preparing and planning the practicum, and in the last chapter, D&M introduced us to curriculum commonplaces, and they said, no matter how you come, whether you like it or not, Professor Rogelski might say, there's certain things we need. There's aims and objectives and courses of studies and questions about sequencing, etc. They took those commonplaces and they've set them out in steps. Why? To bring order to the plurality of concerns that teachers will likely encounter. Here's a summary of the 7 decision points. Decide the kinds of music making your students will pursue. Decide both the musical praxis and the musical challenges, processes and products. A musical challenge, they're saying in brackets there, involves the doing and what Christopher Small would call the concretions of the doing. So there's the process of making the music, and then there's a concretion. It might be a recording, it might be a performance, those sorts of things. So 2 different components to come up in that musical challenge. And a musical praxis might be a particular tradition, like D&M would talk about Ghanaian drumming or jazz or punk or something like that. So what kind of musical community, caring and ethical musical community, you might try to solve these musical challenges, which are processes and products. To be taught and learned in relation to your decisions, we're going to be making music, and we'll be making music within a particular praxis, and that will pose musical challenges. Then decide the components of the musicianship and listenership your students will require to meet the musical challenges. Decide your teaching learning goals in relation to decisions made at 1, 2, 3. Reflect on alternative teaching learning strategies in relation to your decisions at 1 to 4. And so it's recursive, right? We keep going back, and every time we make a decision, we go back again. And 5, reflect on alternative sequences you may require to achieve your teaching learning goals, and decide how to assess and evaluate students developing musicianship and listenership. There it is. There's the 7. And then here, the values and aims of music education are realized through musical actions, through musical thinking in action and knowing in action. And this again is about music being a doing, so that you think as a part of doing and you know as a doing. Musical understanding exhibits itself in action. Just as real music cultures depend on the musicking of practitioners for their existence, continuation, and evolution, music making is the engine. Music making is the engine that powers each music's curriculum as practicum. And then really importantly, like I said, teaching jazz and popular music at the conservatorium. If you're not teaching jazz and popular music, if you're not dealing with listening, then you're in trouble. Just a reminder, in addition, since all forms of music making depend on keen music listening, and since deep listening develops in relation to the 8 component knowings of musicianship, listening ought to be taught and learned in direct relation to musical praxis and pieces students are learning in and through their own music making. They're just on fire. I mean, they're so often on fire, but they're not learning activities that students dip into now and then. I'm looking at you write a melody in 4 bars in D minor. They are not learning activities that students dip into now and then, here and there. Moreover, the musical understanding needed to achieve a variety of musical values is not achieved through incidental, superficial dabbling. Self-growth, self-knowledge, musical enjoyment, and self-esteem depend on students' deepening involvement in musical praxis. They depend on the gradual, sustained, and systematic development of musical understanding. Dude, the practicum pivots on the actions, transactions, and interactions of students and teachers in relation to carefully chosen materials. Meaningful projects, says Gardner, who makes many appearances over the course of the book, but particularly in this chapter, he's going off. Meaningful projects taking place over time. Various forms of individual and group activity are the most promising vehicles for learning. And they talk about entering a reasonably wide range of musical cultures. And just when you think you're getting a handle on diagrams, they give us one in landscape and you've got to go sideways and oh boy, and then you just keep scrolling through. Here's a word that comes up, comprehensive, and I've talked a lot about comprehensive musicianship through performance, that whole movement that continues in the States. The comprehensiveness of the practicum depends on making a full course meal of every musical product or project by developing students' musicianship and listenership fully in all 16 knowledge dimensions in relation to the multi-dimensional nature of musical products. Additionally, difficulties often arise because of differences between the musical desires of students and what teachers consider musically and educationally desirable for students. Conflicts can often be resolved by engaging students in critical thinking about the musical praxis and challenges to be pursued in the practicum. Cool, moving on. The educational success of the practicum depends heavily on the praxis, products, and projects one decides to teach. Kind of a no-brainer, but aside from the continuous development of our own musicianship and listenership as teachers, the most important way we can prepare for the curriculum as practicum is to make, analyze, listen for, contextualize, and reflect contextually on the musical products we intend to teach in the practicum before we begin to teach. That is a key tenet of gold standard project-based learning. In this praxial philosophy, the content of the music curriculum is musicianship plus listenership equals musical understanding. Musical understanding is what we teach. We're teaching for musical understanding. The form of knowledge that is internally generated in students through their musical actions, transactions, and interactions with carefully selected musical praxis and challenges. Additionally, musical understanding is the subject matter knowledge that professional music teachers require to teach it effectively. Oh, this is a good one. This is coming back to what we read about ages ago of music teaching as jazz improvisation. The process of preparing our own musical understandings in relation to each musical product or project we select enables us to anticipate the procedural musical knowledge, verbal knowledge, and so on that our students will need if they are to find, solve, and reduce musical problems. And then we've got decide on teaching learning goals. And then there's some good ones here. Modeling, coaching, scaffolding, articulating, comparative, reflecting, and exploring. Some good words to think about. What does teaching look like? In practice, experienced music educators move in and out of these strategies in a fluid stream of teacher-student interactions. Then there's some descriptions of modeling, coaching, scaffolding, fading. I think this is my favorite diagram. Teacher fades. Students take responsibility. So a lot of heavy lifting early on from the teacher. Fading refers to the gradual removal of supports until students are able to solve problems on their own. A teacher's support can and should fade over longer time periods or even during single lessons as students take more responsibility for finding and solving musical problems. One of the favourite things for Pete and I in our classroom was when people would come looking for us and not be able to find us because we had faded. I'm not talking about cloak of invisibility, but it was just all about the students. All right, and then it's called a reflective practicum because it's typical of this context that several kinds of verbal and not verbal thinking evolve together as students learn how to make music and listen musically. Comparative reflection takes the idea of articulation and reflection one step further. We suggest that the education and power of reflecting on one's musical actions can be boosted by replaying examples of musical thinking in various ways. Go on to talk about postmortems, and that's something that I think we'll just talk about a lot over the next forever. Exploration, what a beautiful word. Generating and selecting. If students are to become critical and creative musical thinkers, they must be coached towards exploring, generating and selecting musical problems and solutions themselves. By gradually fading the supports made available, we encourage our students to explore various decision-making routes and thereby take ownership of their musical goals and accomplishments. Teacher fades, teacher fades, teacher fades. So now we're on to sequences. Even if students can achieve only part of a large task, having the big picture gives them a clear musical goal in mind. With larger goals in mind, students can begin to supervise their own progress toward the whole and self-reflect on their improvements in relation to their understanding of the musical whole. It's all about the gig. And when we're talking about the gig, we're talking about these larger goals in mind. Teachers decide in action. See that? In action, when and how to coach, diagnose, tell, model, reflect, advise, encourage, fade, and so on. In other words, the sequencing of events in the practicum is predominantly interactive. So yes, write out the biggest lesson plan ever, but then it would have hyperlinks to it, and it would be something that would be enacted in action, and it would be unlikely, I would imagine, that it would unfold in the order that you've written down. Maybe sometimes you smash it and think, I'll do this and they'll do that. That doesn't happen very often in my experience. And then this is something that Pete and I have been working on forever, deciding how to assess and evaluate students developing musicianship. Process folio, the concretions of their musicking and ways of thinking about the work that we produce as practitioners. And so there's some beautiful words here. Process folios represent an effort to capture the steps and phases. We have phases in our project for this very reason. Pivotal moments, and for Pete and I, this gives us an opportunity. We love to video record, audio record, take photos, etc. And then student and teacher sit together and look at it and say, what do you think? I don't know, what do you think? And have a discussion about that. Drafts, and we've talked about this is where Ron Berger comes in and drafting and working through that feedback process of kind, helpful, and specific. And this is a beautiful thing, a process folio culture. Thank you, Gardner. The idea of having this streamlined way of generating musical concretions. So it's not about problem solving, it's about problem finding and problem solving, which is really beautiful. This is really good. Musical process folio not only contributes to students' musical problem finding, problem solving, and creative achievement, but also contributes to their self-growth and enjoyment by confirming how well they're meeting creative challenges, and helps teachers and students establish a musical community in the class practicum, a musical culture of practitioners working in common cause. Viva the revolution. And ensemble rehearsal critique. And they talk about, could we please not make the young people write big, long Ch13 blooming things about this and how dangerous it is for to go, I've got a great idea. Let's make them write thousands of words. And then, wait a second, musical practicum and not English essay writing. Also, it's not everybody's thing to write stuff down. So what's another way that somebody might be able to reflect deeply that didn't give them writer's cramp? Then they talk about the practice journal, danger, don't make it a drag. The listening log, danger, don't make it a drag. Caution is advised. Don't overtake the action focus of the practicum. And so I think there's some art and science there in the craft of pedagogy. Here we are. When added to the daily assessments that music teachers make on the fly, process folios help to clarify and verify teacher judgments about individual and group achievements. There is nothing as valuable as in-action critical reflection with student and teacher. What's happening? What just happened? What could we do about it, right? That's where the value lies, right there. Yes, this is great. Students need opportunities to assume multiple roles or stances: performer, coach, critical listener, advisor, composer. And remember, Christopher Small says everything going on in the room is musicking: ticket selling, piano removal, lighting, crowd security, etc. Learners must have opportunities to experiment. And then they talk about what musical experimenting is. It's rigorous, but that's a different sort of rigor than get the exam tables out and go up to the hall. That's a different rigor. This is musician's rigor. Music students should play the experimental game in relation to a moving target, changing the musical results even as these results change with her every move. Also, something you might not be aware of, but we see a lot, is Donald Shern. He's the reflective practice guru, and so a lot of this stuff about reflective practica are coming from his work. Pioneer of the idea of practicing and then reflecting on it, which is what people have been doing forever, but he wrote a book. Cool. And then a big long thing about practicing. And again, how do students know how to practice? In this musical practicum apprenticeship model, they learn how to practice from their community. And how do you practice? Well, you practice like somebody practices in your praxis. Who could help me with that? The classroom music teacher. And so teacher fade's there, right? Like we model and coach, etc., so that our students are maximizing their practice time. And then a practical view of evaluation. So this whole time we've been reflecting with the students in action. And then at the end of a teaching learning episode, or at the end of a series of teaching and learning episodes, this idea of coming back and evaluating it. How did that go? Some stories here about the inclusive music curriculum, which I won't deal with just now because that's too dense. And then we're at the end. Okay, tick.